Hi, Mom. I'm so excited to be here today for our very first episode of Connection from Here.
Hi, Michelle. It's so good to be together with you today as we start this journey of discovering a different kind of connection in today's world. I think you and I have been doing a lot of conversation about the changes that we're seeing and honestly, the changes that you and I have lived through as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think kind of the root of everything that we want to discuss is what people are referring to as the loneliness epidemic.
Yeah.
I know I've experienced it at times, and I think it's something you've experienced as well. More people than ever are stepping away from organized religion. So, where do we turn for support, meaning, and connection? Hi, friends, and welcome to Connection from Here, finding community in a changing world. I'm Michelle Perry.
And I'm Ashley Beatty Perry.
We're so happy you're here.
Yes, and I think there's real reporting that has been going on about this, what has been called this loneliness epidemic. And I think now, Michelle, you're our data person here. You'll have to correct me. I think there's a pretty significant percentage of the population in America right now who really do feel lonely for large portions of their days.
Yeah, so it's actually 1 in 2 people. So 50% say that they experience measurable levels of loneliness on a daily basis. So,
And that's real. I mean, I have experienced that. I think that a lot of people I'm encountering are saying the same things. I think this is those numbers are just being felt in real life
yeah.
by people every day. And one of the things that I think a lot of the research is saying too is this profound loneliness epidemic really does have impacts on our physical health as well. I think some of the
Oh, yeah.
research is showing that everything from like heart conditions to respiratory conditions, even an
Oh, yeah,
increase
yeah,
in
yeah.
the possibilities for stroke, a 50% increase in the risk of developing dementia. This profound loneliness epidemic is not something that's just an emotional thing that people are living through. These pieces really are having profound physical impacts as well for people. So what we are dealing with is quite a serious situation, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, it's the word epidemic is used correctly here. It's a health crisis with physical consequences. Mental,
Yeah,
as to be expected, but the physical ones too.
yeah,
I was shocked to read. I mean, the
yeah.
the disastrous effects that loneliness can have, and this is something that's just grown exponentially in the last few decades. I read that actually there's 70% less in-person interaction for young people than there was 20 years ago. And it's pretty clear why. I mean, why that is with the rise of the digital age, smartphones. I mean, we're
Oh,
on them all the time.
right. And so that sense that people think they're finding connection through digital means, but a lot of times, so what you're saying is like the actual person to person interaction is what has gone
Right.
down. Okay.
Yes, that has gone down, and I think maybe people feel like they're kind of filling that void with their
Yeah.
phones, but it's not just what researchers have found is it's not just quantity of interaction, it's also quality. So
Oh,
maybe
okay.
the interactions that they're having online are not as deep or fulfilling. And it's like they say, you can still be lonely in a crowded room.
That's right. Well, and I hear what you're saying. I think to be in that digital space and to feel like you're
Mhm.
connected, there's still oftentimes something that feels like it's missing. And so that's kind of
Yeah.
alluding to the piece that you were talking about. Is there something about being in physical space together that makes a lot of difference? And I think that goes back to early humans. We really were meant to kind of be in group together. It was almost dangerous to be like put outside the group, the lions or whatever, in the wild, really you did not stand as much of a chance on your
Right.
own as you did if you were part of the group. So I do get that sense of this. There's a physical, like the body senses
Oh,
when
yeah.
you are alone and when you are not having that in-person connection and almost that safety, that feeling of
Yes,
I
that's
am with people and not kind of out here in the wilderness by myself. What you're saying is that type of in person, oh, I feel safe here with community is a little bit just, it's just tougher to find in a digital space.
Right. You and I have said so many times, like, humans were not made to be alone. We are
Right.
creatures of community. And it's
Yeah.
so interesting what you said, like those feelings of anxiety and depression and physical symptoms, like it makes sense because back in the old days, I mean, if you didn't have community, if you were by yourself,
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically a ticket to your funeral. You're not going
That's
to make it
right.
very far. So, I
That's
mean, it
right.
makes sense. It's like even today,
Yeah.
although we could survive by ourselves, we could survive by living a more isolated life. We're not going to live a good life, that's for sure.
That's right. That's right. It's like the returning to our early human roots of this, like we are meant as social communal
Yeah,
beings.
yeah.
And so now that, we are stepping away from that, it gives rise to this sense of loneliness. And one of the things, well, this has certainly been true for you and me both, is that
Uh-huh.
for a lot of people, what is happening is, as we are, so many of us stepping away from religion and religious organizations and what used to provide community for us, for many people that were involved in religious organizations, this was a weekly gathering, an in-person gathering of people. And they would, oftentimes come with a meal and be together, share their, whatever they're going through together. So I think for so much of the history of this country, that connection and that community did seem to be found in these religious institutions, these religious organizations. I think there's some data too about so many of us are stepping away from those religious institutions these days. You and I personally, that has certainly been our story as well. But what are the number? I think it's like
So
30%.
sources say between like a quarter or 25% to 30%, somewhere in there, which is pretty significant. What's even more interesting is how quickly this has happened. As
Oh,
late as the 1980s and 1990s, 70% of Americans said they belonged to a church, a synagogue, or a mosque. But in 2021, these numbers of people who attend church went below 50% for the first time. The majority of
okay.
people in our country are no longer going to church.
Or any religious kind of gathering. Tell me again those numbers. That span of time again was what now? From the late?
From the late 80s, and the 90s is when it first started dropping. So the late 80s, we
Okay.
have at
Okay.
70%, and then we have
Okay.
it down to less than 50% about 30 to 40 years later. So within
Wow.
just like four
That
decades, we're getting 20 percentage point drop in people
drop.
who are members of religious organizations.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
unheard of in history.
Right, right. And to be clear, this is not a podcast about trying to get people back to religion.
Oh,
Let, let,
absolutely not. No.
let us be clear. Let us be clear. I think that's probably good to say at this point. Whatever works for people. If
Right.
obviously, if you find meaning and purpose in religion, but this podcast and our exploration, it does tend to focus on people who have stepped away from those religious organizations. And it sounds like from what you're saying that it has been a profound stepping away in a fairly quick time frame. It really is just a real cultural shift
Right.
for folks in this country.
Also, because a lot of these people who are stepping away, they grew up themselves in religious households.
Okay.
So it's not just a passing of non religion from generation to generation. It's like these
Yeah.
new generations are realizing, oh, this doesn't serve me, this isn't working for
Yeah.
me, and are moving away from it.
The swiftness that
Yeah.
this has occurred in. I mean, so what you're talking about is you could, like, even in, a family, you might have family members who might still be religious
Oh,
themselves,
yeah.
but, younger members of the family may have stepped away from that, which honestly, Michele, I've heard about for some families that in and of itself has caused loneliness. The
Oh,
person who has stepped
yes.
away from religion, oftentimes now there's friction in their family from folks who are still interested in religiosity and interested in the organized religion aspect. And so probably some of the story and some of those numbers is that people are almost like doubly now without community. They no longer want to be a part of the community of the religion. And now
Mhm.
even the community right there in the smaller unit of the family is That's painful. It can be painful to have family members not really understand you're stepping away from religion. I have heard stories where some family members have just been very unaccepting of that, which again compounds the loneliness for people.
And I think you and I have been kind of lucky in a way because we've kind of both stepped away. But I see that if one of us hadn't, how that might create,
Yeah.
because it's your family, so you're gonna love your family, but there would be some tension around that subject, I think. And you and I
Yeah.
are pretty lucky.
Yeah. Your story of stepping away is interesting because, as we've talked about, I am a former pastor. So you actually
Right. It's
grew
like
up in.
it doesn't get more religious.
That's right. You actually grew up in a religious household. I'll start by saying I was a Presbyterian minister. That's the PCUSA denomination of Christianity, and I was a pastor in that denomination, ordained and served churches and congregations, all while raising you and your sister. And so our family, we would find ourselves at church just about every Sunday and maybe once during the week. So
Right.
just to set the context for how you grew up, and I will say also, just for context
Hmm.
as well, our denomination, well, you probably gather that just from the sense that I'm a female and I was a pastor in a church. So the denomination we were part of is a progressive
Right.
denomination. I mean, a denomination that it's not a fundamentalist. It's not considered a fundamentalist denomination or religion. It's not considered like one of these literal,
Interpret the Bible literally.
interpret the Bible like,
Yeah.
here's the earth 2,000 years old kind of thing.
Right.
It wasn't any of that. It was a really an open, and people felt free to be questioning and
Hmm.
exploring, asking questions. And it was not an oppressive religion at all. I didn't
Yeah.
find it's certainly not the congregations I led. So, again, just to set the context for listeners, that's the type of religion that you grew up in.
Right. So, listeners, just to be clear, my mom was a pastor who could curse like no one you've ever met. So she, so
That's true.
we were
That is true.
definitely no. Our family still, had a lot of humor, and it was pretty progressive, and there was actually quite a lot of joy found in the Sunday event and spectacle of it all, of like getting ready to go to church, and oh, there's mom giving a sermon, and oh, we're breaking the bread, we're sharing hugs and talks with neighbors and sharing food together. That was a big part of that. So I'm trying to kind of think, when would you say you kind of started having different thoughts in your mind? Because I know you've always kind of leaned towards questioning and not interpreting things literally, but when did you feel yourself kind of start to make that break?
For me, I really feel like as some political things started to take shape in the country, so we're talking about around like 2016 or so, there were some pretty hateful things that kind of had started up in the political sphere that I stood very much against. The political candidate who is, kind
Oh,
of
let's just say it,
dominating
Donald
things
Trump.
today.
Yep,
That's
he
right.
was.
It kind of, yes, exactly. Dominating things today. Because I think it was almost painful to me. What
Hmm.
I found were so many people in my denomination would not stand up to that and would not take a firm stand in what felt like a time that was very clear to me that people of good heart, people of faith, this would have been a time to stand up with your whole chest and
Yeah.
say, I stand against this hate. I stand
Yeah.
against this kind of ostracizing people, trying to push people out is just not at all what I stand for. And I'm going to say it with my whole chest.
Oh,
To me, what good is your faith if it's not to stand against what is harming other people? I was trained in my seminary to really stand for issues of social justice and social care and connecting with others and standing for the people who are marginalized
yeah.
and people who are hurt so often in this world. And so it was always important to me to really, if I was going to be a person of faith, this is what my faith was about. It was to stand for and stand with and advocate for people who so oftentimes are just harmed and oppressed and made to be ostracized. And so my stand with people on the margins, it really felt like around that 2016 timeframe,
Yeah.
this is a time for people of faith to say, this is not okay. This is not okay. We will not stand for people to be treated with this kind of ugliness and harmfulness. I think that was the first inkling of, this is probably not a good fit for me. I mean, I am a person who my ethics and my value system, I'm just not in an organization here that is really doing much to stand against this. I mean, I think there was a little bit of, we hope things get better or things like that. But no, so few people from my organization were really standing firm against it. So I would say that was for me the moment that I began to think, I'm probably going to be stepping away from this, because what is faith for if not to counter evil in the moments when you see evil taking shape? So that was really my stepping away from religion altogether. I'll say I consider myself at this point to not be religious, and that was probably the first steps for me away from that religious
Right.
organization. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is that it's almost like you were kind of betrayed by the institution of religion and what you thought it stood for. And I like what you said. It's
Yeah.
like, well, what is faith for if it's not to
Yeah.
do good and stand up against
What's
the
evil?
evil and the bad? And what
Yeah.
else is it for? And I think it's
Yeah.
interesting that you mentioned what you say is it was the institution itself and the congregation and the lack of voicing and standing up for what's right. It was the institution of it all. It
Yeah.
wasn't necessarily some like difference in your own mindset towards your beliefs or whatnot. It was more like,
Yeah.
from what I'm hearing, the institution itself that kind of
Yeah.
broke away. And I think that's really common. A lot of people are feeling like the institutions don't speak for them and they don't feel like they represent how they really feel. And
And I think that is an interesting point to make, because you're right. The pain and the betrayal that I
mm-hmm.
felt really, I have heard of people that really wrestle with, there's a lot of inner
Yeah,
turmoil
exactly.
about, as they're stepping away from their faith. It never was that for me. I mean, it really was just this is an institution that at this moment really should stand for something, for goodness
Yeah.
sakes. I mean, what are we doing? I would, hear people who are showing up every Sunday, sitting in a pew, and then, well, what difference does it make if you're not going to say, this is a time that we will not accept ugly hatefulness kind of stuff that's happening? And I think that's interesting, because maybe we'll hear from listeners. I think some people, do have quite a difficult internal struggle about when they
Yeah.
step away from a religion, maybe a faith. For me, because I've never been a literalist and like, oh, you've got to believe this. That piece of it is what I found helpful in my interpretation of ancient text, in the way I was taught to interpret ancient texts were, for the good of bringing about help and care for the poor and the suffering and those who are marginalized. But I understand maybe other people have different understandings of their faith. So, yeah, I thought I was with an organization who really had a lot to say in these moments. And then when that, again, that kind of full throated, say it with your full chest kind of never happened. It felt disappointing, really. Like you said, I think that word of betrayal is so helpful for listeners, because I think it can feel like a betrayal. Your whatever organization was community for you, and now it turns out this is what I thought the community did.
Yeah.
This is what I thought the community was for. And it
Yeah.
turns out, oh, the community apparently doesn't really care.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think this is a great kind of segue to talking about what are the good things in its best day. What would these religious institutions offer that was good and wonderful and because as we're talking right now, and I think this is the opinion of some, and I read an article by Derek Thompson where he talked about how he himself was not a person of faith, but he's realizing over time that there is something to mourn in the loss of faith, and that's mourning the best parts of faith, like
Yeah.
community, connection, reflecting on your values, giving to others, those kinds of things. So although it might be easy to be like, oh, we're so much better off now. And I'm not saying that, oh, we need to go back to religion, like
No.
you said earlier.
No,
That's not
no,
what
no.
we're saying
That's
here.
not this podcast. That is
Right.
not this podcast. No.
Yeah, there might be other podcasts for that, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
no, no. Um, but I think we do need to think about taking those pieces of religion, the good pieces, and thinking about how we can bring them into today.
And in that case, in terms of your stepping away from religion
Yeah.
as well, I have heard you say those pieces you've missed as well. So
Oh,
some
I
of those
have.
good. You want to say more about
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
your journey about that stepping away has been?
Right. So, I was lucky to have a very welcoming institution of worship. I know some people never found a welcoming community at their place of worship. So I think that is also, a privilege that we were able to feel, for the most part, welcome and loved at our place of worship. I know, sometimes it can just be a place of harm and stress, and people are like ostracized by their places of worship. But I did find it as like a little bit of a nest where
Yeah.
you can just go like once a week, no matter what, you're going to be accepted and people are going to be happy to see you, check in, how's school going. People just check in and they ask about you, and like sharing meals together and just laughter. And so it was never even so much about what was being said and read from the text. For me, it was just the place of just love, and as you would say in modern lingo, good energy, good vibes. That's what it was. And I think since
Well,
then I
yeah.
haven't found really a modern non-religious replacement for that feeling.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I think, like in the article, you mentioned the writer Derek Thomas. That's kind of what he was getting at then. It's like, even as a non religious person
Yeah.
himself, like, where do you find the good pieces that religious organizations, can offer in terms of here's what community can look like?
Right.
Here's some food, here's some people who you'll see these people week after week. So they'll know enough to ask about how's your class going at school and how's this going? I know you were struggling in this area.
Yeah.
That piece of community, it did seem to be what a lot of religious institutions do that part very well.
Right.
And like you said, I think it's important to note here. Now, a lot of these institutions are not inclusive and welcoming and, in making sure that everybody feels welcome. But you happen to have the privilege of being part of a community that felt more that way. What you're saying is like, here are people that care. Week
Yes.
after week, I'm going to show up to a place where people,
Yes.
care
Week after.
about me. And it feels like a loss without that type of
Right.
community, is what you're
Right.
saying. Yeah.
And we haven't seen any other, structured event, or place rise to fill that
Yeah.
gap in the void. As people are leaving religion, well, where are they going?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what we've seen. And as Derek Thompson was talking, there's no place or
Yeah.
event that really does the same thing that the good things that religion did at its best. And,
Yeah.
he also noted that Americans unaffiliated with religion are then less likely to do things in community. So that means less likely to volunteer, less likely to be civically engaged. And it's kind of like you lose out on
Yeah.
those community activities, and you feel less
Yeah.
connected to the world in which you're living. So we're kind of floating in our own
Yeah.
spheres now. And yeah, and he even used the phrase, religion is a retaining wall for American hyper individualism. So all those fancy words to say that, like, it kind of saves us, or
Yeah.
at its best it would make us more part of a whole, more
Yeah.
connected to each other, less focused on
Yeah.
ourselves, and less isolated. And yeah, there's no replacement at the moment.
Yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. It really does, because so many of us who've stepped away from that religious organizations, religious
Yeah.
institutions, we don't want the religion, but we
Mhm.
sure would like the community. Again, those good pieces, it is almost a compounded grief, because yes,
Yeah.
here's the religion no more, and that's fine. And people who want to step away, most of us fine with that. But the grief over where is this community, and how can we go about building something where people, because the other thing, Michelle, that I've thought about too, and I think some of the data on this shows, is that just because people have stepped away from religion, it does not mean that they no longer are seeking out purpose or meaning. It does not mean they are no longer seeking out, a source of hope or a place to ask existential questions, like, why are we here? And finding a purpose. That a lot of the people who've stepped away from that, it's not that they are no longer seeking, and asking these big questions. They just don't want to find them there. But my goodness, it would be wonderful to have a community to be able to put those questions in and explore, and over a meal talk about things. And so a lot has been lost in that. The place that so many of us find ourselves now in this, overarching loneliness epidemic, when you start drilling down into that, is that we are without the community and connection that maybe at one time did sustain us, but does no longer. And so here we are, about when there's not exactly a structure built, can we be about building something anew? Is there a way to be about building community, be about building connection, and a place for people to ask the big questions of life? Is there a place that we can build that together, a place of support and care, a place of safety to, again, explore questions of meaning and purpose? Is there a way to build that together in a new way? That's why I'm so glad that we've started this conversation in this podcast. And, hopefully the listeners will join in and be about this exploration with us, and bringing up and building new ideas around these topics of community and connection. Because from what your data showed earlier, we are physically sick without it.
Absolutely. And I think maybe what some religious people perceive as, oh, these cold-hearted people moving away from religion, and they're just icy, and they don't care. They're all about science. And I think you and I and our listeners and so many people want to make clear is that it's the human condition to ask these big
Yeah.
questions, to look for meaning, to look for connection, and feel less alone in this crazy life. And I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation with you as we talk about what it means to be spiritual but not religious, and how do we create a structured community out of something that has been kind of nebulous for folks like us.
Yeah.
So I'm looking so forward to having these conversations with you and exploring what we think could be some solutions. Yeah, I'm very excited.
Me too. And, we'll get into this in future episodes about non-religious chaplains and kind of some professions that, like secular chaplains, that are out there doing some of this work. But one of the things that we non-religious chaplains have said so often is that spirituality really is, the quest of the human spirit, honestly,
Oh, I like that.
and it doesn't inherently necessarily have anything to do with religion. I mean, for some people it
Absolutely.
may, that's fine, but being human spirits in this world, as you said, as we're traversing this life, it's the human condition to seek and ask questions, and to seek out community, to ask the big questions in, to be a part of something bigger, a part of something
Something bigger than
larger.
yourself. Yeah, we
That's
see.
right. That's right. The human condition. We're seeking to be part of something bigger. So we've got a lot of interesting episodes to come as you and I continue this conversation with our listeners, and as we continue to explore these questions and where we are now and kind of where we could look to as we go forward. And one of the things that you and I talked about we'd like to do to make available a little segment for listeners that may be helpful as we are about building care and community into our lives is maybe at the end of each episode have a little segment about a tidbit about how we can build care and connection into our daily lives.
Right. And I know that through all your training and your interactions with people, you've you have a little arsenal of skills for people and things that they can implement in their lives. So, what has been on your mind lately is something people could use?
Yes. And so I think this idea of letting people feel what they feel can be
Hmm.
so helpful to building care and connection and community with others. You know, you try to share maybe about how you're feeling. And I think it's very common for people to be dismissive if you're, you know, feeling something that is bad in any way. A common response to that is people want to say, oh, well, it's not that bad, or, you know, it'll get better soon, or, oh, yeah,
Don't
that
worry.
sounds
Stop worrying about it.
that's right. That's right. That all kind
Oh,
of,
so
you know,
helpful. Thank you. I'll just
yes,
stop
great.
worrying.
Exactly. Now I feel more
So much better.
disconnected than ever and more
Oh, yeah.
alone than ever in my hard feelings. So
Right.
I would say that's a gift we can give each other as we are going through kind of our daily lives for ourselves and for, you know, those we encounter that we care about, is let people feel how they feel. A lot of times they will be able to move through that, but they just need a place to get that out and to
Yeah.
share how they're feeling. And what a gift, you know, to know that somebody just hears you and
Yes.
hears what you're going through and hears your feeling without trying to diminish it and, you know, kind of
Exactly.
sugarcoat it. So that would be a little something we could all take with us this week and maybe implement in
Yeah.
our daily lives as we're seeking and trying to build community.
Give space for feelings, the good, the bad, and the ugly,
Yeah,
because they're all real, and
that's
it
right.
helps to get them out, to just to know people are hearing you. So absolutely, I
That's
know you've
right.
done that for me so much over the years. So um,
And we'll be here to do it for our listeners as well. Y'all write in and let us know how you are. We look forward to hearing from you soon. And thank you for being on this journey with us. We'll talk
right,
soon.
we'll talk soon.
Bye.